Lucy is here, I think.
Sorry, thank you for waiting.
Okay, Lucy, if you would just like to introduce yourself.
And Lucy, she, if you wish to refer to me, thanks.
Thank you. Before we start, is there anyone on the panel who could, by any chance, or maybe one of the volunteers, share their screen with a timer? If that's possible, it would be great. If not, then in any case, okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would still ask all of you to time your own speeches as well, not exceed the allotted time of 7 minutes, 15 seconds. Also be careful of the first and last minute, which are protected. It would not be nice for us to have to forcibly stop you from speaking. That being said, as soon as the timer is up. Okay. So you will be getting the timers in the chat, it seems, because the volunteer cannot share the screen. Or can they? There it is. The timer is up. Excellent. This means that if everything is ready, I would like to invite the Prime Minister to begin this debate. Here.
All right. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Really sorry. Could we have a counting up timer as opposed to a counting down? Sorry.
Thank you. That's definitely better for sure. Let me know. Can I start? Is everything ready?
Whenever you're ready.
All right, perfect. 3, 2, 1. Let me directly get into the framing of this debate. We support the delaying of elections in times of demonstrable, significant health crises. What does the word crisis specifically mean? That means two things. First of all, that there is a severe urgency in the near term to do something about a significant problem that is getting worse and worse. In other words, that means today day-to-day policy is super important in order to prevent significant harms to many people in the population. Second of all, a crisis implies that it is a relatively short-term issue. It is not something that will last years or something like that. No, a crisis is a short-term thing that now needs to be solved, but will be over in a bit of time as well. We don't have to defend, and we're not talking about delaying elections for something like years or something like that. It is probably something like a few months until the worst of the crisis is over, until it's under control. That is what we have to defend. Note, we also don't have to defend people or leaders acting like there is a crisis, while this is definitely not true. Because first of all, the motion wording implies that we have to defend it in times where those crises actually specifically exist, not in other times. Second of all, because we also think, even if you don't buy that, that there are checks and balances that prevent that from being the case in almost all functional democracies. For example, Supreme Courts that can prevent this from being used by political leaders. Two arguments for their own gains. Two arguments in my speech. First, why we think the election is not representative at the moment you hold it in a time of crisis, meaning that it is better to delay it on the comparative than having it now. Second argument, why we think it is super important to solve the health crisis in the short term, and that is very much more difficult at the moment you have an election going on. First argument, why the election is not representative. There are three main reasons why that is the case. The first reason is that in times of severe health crises, turnout is going to be incredibly low for the election. Turnout is going to be low due to three main reasons. The first one is very simple. People are very sick. Many people are very sick and therefore are not going to show up to vote. The second reason is people being scared. People don't want to get the virus. People don't want to get infected or something, which means they definitely want to stay away from places where other people are going to stay away from voting booths, etc. We think many people don't necessarily prioritize voting over everything else and will put it it aside in order to save their own health. Third reason why turnout is going to be significantly lower is because there are many voting infrastructure problems. Think, for example, of a shortage of staff in voting booths, which means that there are lines of 2 hours, for example, where people have to wait because people are being sick or people don't want to work there because they would get in touch with thousands of other people. Think of other kinds of infrastructure problems that would exist that make it significantly more difficult to organize a well-oiled election. The key difference between this type of low turnout and other elections where you might have low turnout is that here the turnout is not low because of political reasons, right? Because people feel disconnected from politics or don't want to vote or something. They want to vote ideally, but they don't because they have this overriding short-term thing that prevents them from being able to do so. We think that is a fundamentally different type of low turnout because these people actually do have a political preference and would vote in the counterfactual world where there was no disease. Note that this low turnout is especially bad in certain demographics. For example, first of all, clearly old people who are severely more at risk of health issues. Second of all, people from very poor backgrounds who often, for example, can't afford healthcare and are in general more likely to get sick because of unhealthier living conditions as a result of not having the wealth to be able to afford more. We think these people are disproportionately not represented in these type of elections because, which we think definitely skews the outcome of that election. So ultimately that low turnout, and the low turnout, which means many people don't get represented even though they would want to. And second of all, that skew means that the election outcome doesn't represent the true political preferences of the people that would otherwise come up. The second reason why we think the election is not representative is because this health crisis in the short term takes up all attention, both in politics and political debates and in parliament, but also in the media where every newspaper, the front line every day is always about that health crisis. There are two reasons why that's the case. The first reason is because it is such an urgent issue that it takes up all attention. But second of all, note that health crises specifically are incredibly scary for people, right? You care about your own health. It's the silent killer, the invisible killer. I think that is something that takes up a lot of attention because people are incredibly scared. That means that attention gets drawn away from all other issues, much worse than in normal instances where there's something else going on. This is something that takes up all the attention. Therefore, we think the government and the election is not going to be decided on the important things for the next 4 years, but purely on this one thing now, considerably more than in other cases. We think that is not representative of either the issues that are going to be important in the next 4 years or the true political sort of preferences of the people, because now they make their choice based on one thing and one thing only. The third reason why we think the election is not representative of two political preferences is because the health crisis interferes with election logistics. For example, campaigns cannot be organized, which means many people don't get the information needed in order to make a proper vote. It means that, for example, the ruling party cannot participate because they need to constantly be in government making certain decisions and can't go out sort of talking to people on the streets or something like that. All these kind of things are sort of these kind of election logistics are incredibly important for people to be able to get informed and to be able to make a vote that represents their true political interest. Why then do we think on the comparative it is better to delay that election with a few months? First of all, we think term lengths are relatively arbitrary and not so incredibly harmful to push, especially when you compare it to the outcome that happens under their side of the house, namely that people are stuck with an unrepresentative government for the next 4 years, which is both bad from a principle level because we think the government should represent the people, and that is the thing that legitimizes their existence in the first place, but also from a practical level, because the things that the government is going to do in the next 4 years are not the things that people would want them to do in the next 4 years, but the election is not representative anymore. Therefore, that is my first argument. My second argument is why we think it is super important to solve the health crisis in the short term. This election interferes significantly with the option to do so for two reasons. The first one is that electoral pressures right before an election are at their absolute maximum, which means politicians don't want to do anything unpopular. Note that this is way worse than in normal situations, because normally there's some time still for an election. People can forget a bit and can regain a bit of perspective. Currently, during that crisis, that can't happen. Especially here, this is a big thing because the necessary policies to combat the health crisis are very stringent and people really, really dislike them. Second of all, we think people and parties and leaders are also campaigning, so therefore they can't focus on government enough. Panel incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you for the speech. I would now like to invite the leader of the opposition to continue the round.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Then we'll start in 3, 2, 1 now. Panel, I will first have 2 extraneous points of rebuttal. After that, I will have 3 points of substantive in the speech. First, why we value democracy above everything else. Second, why there are pretty feasible alternatives to in-person voting, and why we're more likely to implement them outside of the House, which we probably should do anyway. Thirdly, what happens to governments if they remain in power, if they are pushed out of power. Okay, so let's move into the rebuttal. First point of rebuttal. Opposition in essentially the framing and then the last point make a big point out of day-to-day policy is going to be sort of inhibited by the crisis and by election campaigns. We think this is plainly untrue. Day-to-day policy, so the things that are not directly concerning the crisis, but just management of the state, is usually done by administrative personnel and not political personnel. That usually doesn't change even during election times. This is not political personnel outside of the debate. Second point of rebuttal on the large point they make about elections being unrepresentative. A couple of things here. When it comes to the low turnout, we tell you there are going to be alternatives. See our second point. We think like in-person voting has easy alternatives that should be implemented and can be implemented. The infrastructure, therefore, and much of their first point simply doesn't stand in this debate. Second thing to note in this is on the principle of representative democracy. We tell you, one, the turnout being low in the status quo is oftentimes due to structural reasons, racism and discrimination, not just people not caring. Therefore, it is not true that this is a worse reason. Okay, yeah, I think again, old people is again outside of the debate because we can implement easy alternatives. Okay, moving into the substantive. First point of substantive is why we value democracy above everything else. We think a couple of things are relevant here. The only way that allows people to express preferences in intervals in a democracy are elections. That is what we value. A couple of things to note on this, especially in times of crisis. Always, and in times of crisis in particular, the basis on which you have voted in the election before might have changed. This is, again, particularly important now, more so than ever, for a couple of reasons. Because while, for instance, take the US in 2016, you might have voted for Donald Trump because you like his economic policy or his brushness against immigration. We think now maybe you do care more about healthcare when they tell you, and this is also rebuttal to part of their case, that we shouldn't have elections now because the health crisis is an overriding issue that covers up everything else. We tell you this is true in almost every single election campaign. Look at recent elections in European countries or even in the US, where xenophobia and migration has been the overriding issue, and more important to the electorate than issues that are probably in fact more important. But secondly, we tell you in this particular case, it is probably something that actually is more important. So perhaps it should be the deciding factor because that literally affects people's life unlike fear of migration. But again, uncomparative, there's always an overriding issue, or almost always. Okay, for election logistics, we think the ruling party not being able to campaign is simply untrue. On the contrary, press conferences, if you look at a country like Austria, gives the government additional screen time where they can portray how competent they deal with crisis. We think you can use that for campaigning as well. We don't know whether you should, but it's untrue that you don't have screen time. Okay, B. We think already at a time when government overreach is possible and more likely. This is incredibly important now and different from the A point. Therefore, is we tell you, we give now an additional incentive to government overreach at a time at which this already happens, including, secondly, less scrutiny on that overreach for executive powers. If you look again at a country like Austria, where elections work perfectly fine, but usually there have been emergency measures passed during the corona pandemic, which have been illegal in structure. We think, and this is a country where there is a lot of scrutiny. We think this is largely problematic in other countries. We tell you, it is very tempting for governments to try to avoid that scrutiny in times of crisis. If there is an election, it is harder for them to avoid that scrutiny than on the comparative. Lastly on this, it is very unclear to us how we can foresee the end of this crisis. So it is untrue that it will be a couple of months. It might be 2 years. It might be even a longer time. Again, Rebecca, before I go on, I'll take closing if they have something. Closing. Okay, then opening.
So there's still going to be constitutions, there's still going to be a culture of democracy. I just think it's highly unlikely that all of a sudden the Chancellor of Austria thinks this is my chance, let's go for an autocracy.
Right, okay. So panel, first of all, maybe not the Chancellor of Austria, but maybe the Chancellor of Poland or Hungary or Turkey. But secondly, we don't tell you it's going to go for all-out autocracy, but we are saying it is taking steps that limit democracy. And we think that even Donald Trump floating the idea that maybe we should postpone the election is incredibly problematic. And if you have a constitutional majority in parliament, you also can change, as happened in Hungary, the constitution of a country. We don't say it will lead immediately to dictatorship, but we think it is highly problematic nonetheless. Second point, alternatives. We tell you it's very easy and should be implemented to have non-personal voting, online voting, mail-in ballots. We think this is less likely to going to happen on their side of the house. Why? Because just canceling the election is sort of the easy way out. If that is not an option, because we don't allow it, don't think it should be allowed or should be done, you will have to bother about it. You will have to think about this. Obviously, time management is an issue, but we think in most cases these elections are going to be weeks or months ahead. So you will have the time to implement alternatives. This is easily doable in most countries. Lastly, quickly, what happens to the governments? I think we think that if the government changes, we think it is more likely a more competent government is being voted in. But if not, we think at least the message that even a not so competent government will take will have more buy-in by the population, which is still better than having a competent government in place that the population doesn't buy into. Proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. I now invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue this round.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. Sorry, just getting my notes. During the current COVID crises, most of the elderly, most of the ill, most of those who are vulnerable are afraid to go outside because they're afraid to get a virus that they don't understand and that they don't see. During the Ebola crisis, it was rural areas in Sierra Leone where the infrastructure shut down completely. During the AIDS crisis, it was those who were gay and who were excluded from society who were dying by the bunch. I think that the issue is that very often health crises not only hit the most vulnerable, but now continuously exclude them from the political process, not granting another 3 months of a badly, or like not perfectly representative government, but creating another 4 years of that government. I think what this debate's about is 1, democratic accountability, under which side of the house is it better, but 2, it's about health and whether people will be healthier or not. Those are the exact things that I'm going to talk about. But firstly, I'm going to talk about this idea of this debate is actually about Poland and Hungary. I think that the assumption under this argument is absolutely ridiculous for one reason particularly. I think that given the fact that democracy is so vulnerable and is very difficult to uphold, you need strong institutions in order to get that, to get a democracy, right? I think that given the fact that in Hungary, Orban already controls a lot of the media, controls a lot of the political power, controls a lot of the institutions, he can do whatever he wants. He doesn't need that health crisis. He can do it based on the refugee crisis or something else. And he's able to to grasp and like control the political process. So then it becomes a comparative where on their side of the house, Orban has the ability to do this as a result of literally anything, and under our side of the house he also has the right to do that under a health crisis. I just don't think it's super comparative. If this is about democracies that are already slipping towards an autocracy, I don't think that this is needed. But two, I think that there is an important comparative. I'm not sure why Orban is not able to capitalize on this when there is a crisis and people have to vote right now, given the fact that he can now make rules around health, given the fact that he can make rules around people who are able to go and people who aren't able to go, given the fact that particularly vulnerable and poor communities are very likely to be afraid to go voting. I think Orban will benefit a lot from having a vote right now, and that makes it more likely that he's able to grasp power. So I'm just completely unsure what the comparative is here. When they talk about governments overreaching and how some governments are able to take away all privacy, two things. I think one, there's future accountability. We're not saying we're postponing elections until forever, and people are able to remember what happened like 6 months ago, which means that they're going to be able to hold governments to account. But secondly, I think given the fact that governments know that they're going to be held to account later and they are postponing elections, I think many governments will be extremely careful because they know they're going to get that much scrutiny later. I think that is something that happens under our side of the house. I think thirdly, there's still all of the other democratic institutions that we have, like courts, like parliament, that are holding you to account. Okay, on to democracy. Opening opposition stands up and they've won, or like they think they've won this entire clash when they say the postal vote exists or a online vote exists. One, I think in the majority of countries there is no infrastructure to support this. Sierra Leone does not have the infrastructure to get online voting, definitely doesn't have the infrastructure to get postal voting. I think that means that large parts of the country are going to be excluded. I think for large parts of the country this is not something that actually works. But two, David explains to you why the democratic process is more than the moment that you tick a fucking box. The democratic process, the ability to campaign, the ability to talk to people, the ability to come together and discuss the future of a country. Those are all things that are impossible under a health crisis because people coming together is seen as a huge spreading risk, even if it's not like because people can like get the disease from the air or like can influence each other. I think that is something that one, people are so afraid that they're very unwilling to come, and two, the health, like the illness has to spread some way. I think people coming together is the most likely way. But three, what David explains to you is that it hits particular groups like the elderly. I don't think the solution to the elderly being excluded is making the vote online. I think that a lot of people who are illiterate, a lot of people who don't understand the internet that well, or a lot of people who already feel like it's difficult are now going to have higher costs compared to the people who can simply go somewhere and vote there. So I think that doesn't deal with it at all. Okay, I'll take a POI from closing opposition.
So about accountability, obviously the comparative for governments is being held accountable now versus being held accountable a year from now. It's better to be held accountable when you in a year where you can do spins and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I'll talk about that right now. I actually think long-term accountability is better than short-term accountability. And that is for one particular reason. In the short term, it is nearly impossible to solve a health crisis, which means that you cannot point to the success you had in curbing the issue. Donald Trump has very few, like either he has to shut down the entire country having huge economic harms, or he has to accept the fact that there will be corona everywhere. That means that no matter what he does, the population will be extremely difficult. What does that do? It creates an incentive to then push it upon blaming the victims for not being careful enough or blaming a cause like China. There's a reason Reagan in the 80s, when the AIDS crisis just started, called it the gay disease and blamed people for having gay sex, because he wasn't able to point towards any successes. I think on the long term, you're able to actually point towards the ways in which you succeeded. One, you're able to point towards other countries that did worse, which means you as a government can say that you did really well. I think that means you're more likely to actually look at the results of something. When you politicize it, you have an incentive to push this towards the victims. You have an incentive to spin it a lot more because there's not yet any sort of success that you can point towards, given the fact that health crises take a little time to adapt to. David tells you that very often this takes over so many of the other issues, and you politicize it that much that it becomes something like the Republicans say A, the Democrats say A, we're not going to have a fight about who knows best about health policy. Hint, they don't. It would be better if the civil service has more power over that, but when it becomes the most important thing in the entire election, it is very unlikely that they're going to be able to do so. The second reason why I think elections bring a lot of bad ideas, like a lot of bad causes for health, is simply it brings a lot of people together. Like people hang out during, I don't know, election watching parties. People hang out when they meet each other other when they're voting. I just don't think that's a good thing when there's a disease. But thirdly, what David explains to you is that now, because politicians have to both govern a crisis and run a campaign, neither of those are done well, which means both the politicians are going to be distracted, and politicians are, so they're not going to do very well the health crisis, but they're also going to be distracted because they have to deal with getting votes. I think that crises can take a long time. Or like opening opposition says crises take so long. I think the important issue here is that you can adapt. The first couple of months when the AIDS crisis hit the gay community, they didn't know what hit them. Then they were able to adapt, build infrastructure, and take care of each other a lot more. It was still bad, but they were then able to participate in the political system. Lastly, I think David already explains why democracy, I think I've explained why democracy isn't going to be more flawed, but I think too, democracy isn't the most important. You need to be alive in order to vote, which I think means that the health
You are
crisis—
over time, please stop speaking. Thank you for that speech. I now invite the deputy leader of the opposition to continue the round.
Can I just check that I'm audible?
Yep.
Great, thank you. Panel, 3 points in my speech. First, about logistics. Second, about short-term policy and on which side you get better a resolution of the crisis. And lastly, I will look at checks on democracy and what happens with the elections. All the rebuttal to OG is interwoven in this. So first, let's look at logistics. And we get this idea from OG that says, look, you may not, that they don't want to defend using this as an excuse, right? Because crises are necessarily short-term. But then they describe Corona as exactly the kind of crisis they are talking about. Panel, notice that the crisis on the scale and level that would require to have in order for it to even fall under the definition of what is a national actual health crisis is really, really large, right? It needs to affect a significant amount of the population. It needs to be something that can be transmitted easily, that you cannot easily control, right? Or that we don't know we can easily control, such as we now know that we can easily prevent transmission of HIV, right? It needs to be something that is really, really, really massive, right? The problem is when you have something like Corona that is as massive and as widespread is that it might be over 2 months from now, but it's very unlikely that it's going to be over 2 months from now, because by now we know that even if we find a vaccine, it's going to literally take years until we manage to vaccinate a significant amount of the population, because it takes a long, long time to produce and distribute the vaccine, even after you get to the long trial phase. But moreover, we're not even sure that once we manage to distribute a vaccine, will it even still be efficient, or will the virus have already mutated past it, right? So if you think Corona is a good excuse to cancel elections, then you need to be prepared to defend that Corona might still be a good excuse to keep canceling those elections 5 or 10 years from now. And they say, only until you get the crisis under control, right? But we haven't gotten Corona under control in more than 6 months, and it doesn't look like we're going to be getting it under control anytime soon, because every time we think we do and we allow people to start moving, cases start spiking again, right? So what is that Schelling point when the crisis is under control and is now no longer a crisis that warrants canceling elections, right? But also, even if they don't want to defend using this as an excuse, when this is the norm that you can cancel elections for crises, we already know that governments can make up crises to justify a lot of things. If you now have the norm that it's normal that elections get postponed, that is also something that makes it easier in the future for it to be used as an excuse with less scrutiny once the population has already accepted that it might be a legitimate excuse, right? But also on the idea of election not being representative, right? I think that there are many, many reasons why, yes, it is hard to implement a postal vote or an online vote if you don't have one, right? And it might take a few months. Yes, you can't do it last minute, but you will never do it unless you have to, right? You can mitigate the fact that some people might be old and illiterate, right? But look, staff requirements for counting letters sent from across the country are much lower, and postal services and postal workers are essential workers that keep working anyway, right? It's very unlikely for the government, moreover, to have the incentive at the point at which they can't delay the election, they can't take the easy way out, they will still have the incentive to enable as many people as possible to vote, simply because their own supporters might be prevented to vote, right? Their own supporters are likely to be spread across regions, they are likely to be spread across vulnerable groups, right? Notice that very, very young people are also dying of Corona, even if we label the elderly as the most vulnerable, right? Also, like, I think Ingo dealt with the idea that you can't campaign. Like, the ruling government is in constant contact more than ever with the population during a pandemic. If you do a good job, you are probably going to have the best campaign ever, right? But also, let's look at what the idea that it takes up all the attention, right? Ingo already tells you that most elections are one or two issues, right? And this is clearly going to be a very, very important issue, right? But also, if the crisis is severe enough to warrant this, this is going to be the most important issue 4 years from now as well, because panel is going to take way more than 3 months to get out of the economic crisis that Corona has done. But and this is important, panel. If their logic is that if you elect someone based on what happens in a crisis, that person or that government may no longer be representative when the crisis is over. That same logic means that someone that you elected before the crisis is not someone that represents what you might want and need during a crisis. I don't think anyone on government can convince you that what happens during Corona, how many lives we save and how we manage to save the economy from tanking is not the most fucking important thing that you will decide what you want to vote on your government on, right? So if there's a trade-off, we would much rather have those elections happen during the crisis, as early as possible in the crisis, right? That is not something we should deny to people if you care about democracy at all, right? But also, I think that elections are also more conducive to solving more problems because there's more scrutiny on government by the public and press, because there's more airtime given to opposition criticism. But not only that, there's an immediate incentive for the government to act and neutralize it, because if the opposition criticism is right, and if people are dying, right, if the economy is tanking, if people are losing their jobs, and the opposition claims they can do it better, you can't hide that. You will lose the votes. That is when there is an imperative for government to care about minorities, right? Because if you give or don't give tax breaks to corporations, they'll remember it 3 years from now, panel. But the average voter does not have the attention span to vote 3 years from now on what happened today, right? So if we want the minorities to be protected, then the imperative to help the minorities that we see that are suffering will be most powerful now, right? Not only that, but they need that help now. So even if we are appalled still 3 years from now at how they were treated, if we vote 3 years from now, it will be too late to have helped them. Closing.
Why do you think that democracy is more important than saving lives in this moment? In this,
if you ask me this why, you have clearly not listened to me explaining to you that probably if you allow elections, you also get better crisis solvency. That is also something that you need to deal with. You can't pigeonhole our case into you are weakening democracy. But thank you. I am moving into we are weakening democracy, right? Because Emma says that if you have elections now, but you haven't had success, you would spin it. But if you have success later, you no longer have to spin and hide, right? That shows that Emma is also buying into the premise that voters are short-termists and that they're unlikely to punish you 2 or 3 years from now for what you did right now. But it also means that the government gets away with a longer period of suffering, a longer period of people dying and things tanking if they manage to turn it around later. That is also something that leads to more harm that could have potentially been prevented. But also on the checks of democracy. Term limits are codified in every single constitution I have ever read, right? So saying there's a constitution doesn't mean anything when you're breaking the constitution. As Donald Trump has shown us, norms are only as powerful as the buy-in into them. If we normalize breaking them for some reasons, it will be very hard to draw lines in the sand in the future. Panel, I think the crisis is managed better and people are represented more on side opening opposition.
Thank you for that speech. I now invite the member of the government to continue the round.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Now, in CG, we believe that the core issue of this debate has massively been forgotten in the 80% of the debate in opening house. This debate is probably not about whether you're going to get a little more percentage of turnout or a little more years without voting or a little worse of democracy, but rather if having elections will actually kill a massive number of people in many countries, and therefore if we should take the bullet and admit the harm of a worse democracy as a consequence of saving lives. I'm going to do that and hence win the debate on that point. So first, on public health crisis. Look, OG was very good telling you why possibly during the voting procedure some cases would be greater and that there would be some distractions. OO is also trying to claim that probably we can solve some of them with electronic voting, and also it's told to you that they take better decisions when you pay attention to the issue. What we're going to prove to you is that when you take elections during a pandemic such as the corona, bad decisions are taken for a number of reasons. First reason why there's bad decisions taken, because you want to be populist in order to get votes. What does imply? The first thing that it implies is that you don't take economic policy that can be seen as bad. For example, you don't order mandatory closures on business which could be impacted because you don't want those businesses to outvote you. For example, restaurants, for example, discos. In Spain, Mallorca and Ibiza are open right now during the pandemic just because government don't want to be blamed. So you don't take economic policies. You also don't take policies which restrict individual rights, i.e. you don't do lockdowns as a consequence of people value a lot their liberty. Hence, they also value people who give them liberty. Hence, many times, very useful policies that could be enacted and that are necessary won't be enacted, especially taking into account that the opposition can capitalize the alternative. They can say, look, I'm going to do it, outvote him. So you don't put those policies in place due to those populism measure. You don't also take measures that could look out of control. So you don't put measures that could look that you're taking out of control. That means, for example, don't banning certain things to happen as tourism. We are admitting tourists here in Spain because we believe that if we didn't, we would be giving the sensation that we are worse off. So A, populist measures leads to bad decision making. Secondly, we believe that when there's election, you have a massive incentive to lie with the data in order to generate people the impression that things are going well. So you might recognize this when I say it, but slow down the testing, slow down the testing. That's what you're gonna say. You're gonna be the Donald Trump saying to your people, don't publish the data, or just fake them, or just tell them that the PCR is the one relevant. So you're gonna fake the data in order to be better off in the image. You also have incentives to take measure to see that you're doing good. For example, in the autonomous community of Madrid, they closed a hospital specially dedicated to coronavirus just to think that they were handling the crisis good. They didn't, they weren't. We were the most capital in Spain with more cases of corona, but they did it because they want to project the image that they were doing good. Consequence, you populistically take measures, you do things to pause off and to not lose the elections, and that is very bad. But not only that, as a consequence to have the elections, you possibly take worse decisions as a consequence of the possibility to change government. When there's elections, due to the post-2008 crisis, in most countries in the world, there's a fragmentation of the voting. That means that after the elections, it's difficult to form governments immediately, more difficult because of the fact that there's many parties. Consequently, it will be difficult to form governments that can exert the necessary measures, governments that also, when they change, if they're different, they will need to catch up with a lot of information that was pretty relevant during the pandemic. The consequence of all of this logic is fourfold. First, that you don't take urgent decisions that could be adopted and really necessary in order to avoid pandemics. That you don't take decisions that could avoid further spreading of the corona, of the pandemic. But most importantly, that you lose lives of people. Why do we tell you this is the most important thing in debate? Two reasons. First, because in the comparison of temporary or long term, even if we buy the bullet of OO and concede that there's 2 years of these elections, let's give them 5 years of this prorogue. I don't think it will happen for many reasons, but let's give them that. The comparison is many people lying. 100,000 people in the US died because of the coronavirus 50,000 in Spain, and it has only in the middle. But second consequence is because of the different on the harm, the abstract harm for a whatever harm in democracy that most likely can be controlled by Supreme Courts is to be compared to many deaths which are irreversible and which are directly caused by the government. For that reason, we believe that even if we bite the bullet, even if we lost massive democracy, like 20% of the good democracy that US have, we think that 200,000 people not dying is worse off. That's the first class in debate. I think we win solely on that. But still, let's go to the second time and democracies and what will happen with democracies. Look, OG told you a very interesting thing, which is turnout will go low and hence elections are not representative. OO told you, but you can fix that, and probably there's ways to fix that. We agree with both, probably, but this is not the important thing. The important thing is that when you have elections during this process, there's an overwhelming power of the government to bias voting. People or governments will be telling the people that either they maintain them in power or more deaths will occur. They will be using the argument that there is necessarily the experience that the others don't have. That the 2 years or the year that they've been combating coronavirus, it is essential to be combating the crisis. People, even if they don't like them, they like their lives. They like being better off. They like not dying their familiars, their parents. So that's the consequence why many people here in Spain will be willing to vote Pedro Sánchez and when he's left, because of the reason that they believe that the capacity that he have acquired during these 2 years could not be acquired otherwise. But not only that, think not on the US, not in Europe, but in those semi-democracies, which could also take many measures that restrict the media in order to not report on cases given the state of alarm that they can declare. The less debates that you will have, and in most countries, how you can influence due to the massive power you will be exerting when you have the ability to coerce rights due to states of alarms. It is not that you can vote. It is not turnout. It is the fact that you have a government with massive capacity to overwhelmingly turn the result of the elections. Look, it is not important to debate, but even if we win, because the important thing in democracies is that the government in place don't subvert democracies through their power. Very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. I now invite the member of the opposition to continue this round.
Okay, good. Oh wait, you already gave me a stopwatch. I don't need a stopwatch. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, this motion creates a government that is not accountable and has no checks and balances, which leads us to make bad decisions that will and bad handling of the health crisis, and also a lack of legitimization to rule. 3 points in my speech. Firstly, why we do have a lack of accountability, specifically in these times of crisis that we do have in the comparative of having elections. Secondly, what's the impact of that? A failing government, lots of death, and way more economic damage. Thirdly, the lack of legitimacy of that government and the potential for corruption. Before that, our Ebola we would have given in PUI, but CG failed to allow us to engage. Their sole case is these people will do, these governments will make populist steps to look good. Look, if these steps are bad as they describe, they don't look good, as we've just so eloquently heard. Since the handling of the crisis is the sole issue of the campaign, and everybody can see the rising death toll, it's against your interest to make these kind of bad policies. Now, CG talk about Spain. I don't know if there's a close election in Spain, close by. It seems like bad governments is simply independent of having election anytime soon. We agree, some states have bad and populistic governments, but it seems that it's unconnected there. And therefore, the important thing in this debate is us being able to hold these governments accountable, for which elections are critical. Let's talk about the lack of accountability that happens in status quo. Because let's talk about what governments do in cases of emergency. First of all, they have emergency laws that give them unlimited authorities, which makes them essentially legally immune from criticism from their oppositions in their parliaments, in the legislature, all that sort of thing. Even if the law specifically doesn't do that, doesn't turn it into authoritarian mode, there's a huge pressure on the side of the opposition within that state to not object to the handling of the government, right? This is a crisis. We need to band together all together now. You can't confuse us with a policy. We need to have a direct policy. You're not allowed to do that. You're costing life when you sabotage us. Also, we think the judiciary can help here because most of these decisions are simply not something you can judge in a court. There's no court that will say you need to open up the economy now or you were wrong in handling in this specific point, which means that the only check and balance mechanism that we have, especially when we have these laws to criticize the decisions of the government, is election. Let's talk about how accountability specifically is improved when you have elections. When you have elections, you have an opposition candidate, right? Who's in their interest is to make criticism, point out points of failure, and give concrete mechanism as to how you solve them, right? Also, it's publicly expected of them to do that, specifically when the government is failing, specifically when they don't do well. There's a public pressure on that figure to how can you not criticize them when they do this, when you do that? Note, this is criticism and holding accountable that doesn't happen otherwise, right? Even if the challenger loses in the election, we think the governments are likely to co-opt their ideas that are better simply to satisfy the parts of the public that voted for them, and even especially if they actually voted on things that are right? Also, the other mechanism here is simply the public, who we actually trust in this case, right? To make the right decision, even in this case. Firstly, because we think they are likely to listen to experts, even if the government is refusing to do so. The obvious example here is Fauci, but we think that the US isn't the only state with anti-intellectual government, right? Why are they listening to them? Because they're a calm, cool voice, they're expert, they're doctors. We like to listen to doctors, especially when there's a health crisis. We like to go with them. Also, the other mechanism of democracy, the wisdom of the masses and the people that, and the aggregate wisdom that we trust to lead us in general way. The fact that each and every member of society knows what's best for them and can weigh what's best for them, as in general healthcare or open up the economy or things like that. We think all of these are mechanisms that only exist when you let the public sound their voice. When you don't have that, you get my second case, the impact and massive damages to the public. Let's take OG before that.
We've explained that those who are hit hardest by the health crisis are least able to vote and therefore least able to hold the government to account. If anything, you get a skewed account.
Emma, I'm sorry. I'll give you enough mechanism where these people can vote. I don't know. Like, you can have the election last a month. You can have them staggered out by areas for voting votes. You can have mail-in votings even in developing countries. All your cases dependent on the lack of the mechanisms. The fact that they exist drops you out of this debate completely. I'm sorry. What do you have when you have these bad governments? Mass death and terrible economics, right? Note, in a point of framing, if the public in this time of fear and crisis, of lack of certainty and tending towards like who's in charge right now, if they chose to replace you, it means that you're a bad government and handling this crisis, right? What does it do to the debate? Note that this is where PM noted their most of their damage, most of their problem, the death that changing regimes at this time causes. But if the current government causes more death, we think that's preferable. Now, how are they so failing, right? They have bad conflicting policy, like opening and closing restaurants and other places, in and out, making confusing messages to the public, being bad leaders at conducting cooperation with the public at things like social distancing or putting on a mask or things like that, or simply being stupid and anti-intellectual like DeSantis, the government of California. Now, note this brings us to another massive impact there. The fact that the government needs to handle the burden of banning all elections, including in like the state and the district level, means that we have a huge expansion of impact there. Because if you can't even replace the dumb governor of that specific state, even if the entire, let's say, US here is being good, that means that you still have a hotbed on infection. The crisis continues and all of the economic and death impact of that. Now, let's weigh the impact of government decisions. In the times after the crisis, the decision made by the government are simply not as impactful because it takes time for them to trickle down to the public, to influence the market, to influence how people handle their lives in the status quo. But specifically, when we still have when we're still in the middle of the crisis, when the time to have a competent government is most crucial, because that's when in a short time they impact the amount of debt and the stability of the economy. That's when we need to be able to change them and hold our current government accountable. Therefore, so proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. I now invite the government whip to conclude the debate from the government side.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there is a bit of echo though.
And now?
It's okay now.
Okay, perfect. I will start in 3, 2, 1. Most team of this debate miss the most important thing in this debate, which is that people is dying, and that is by far the most important thing in the debate. In worst case scenario of all the teams that are talking about democracy, we are going to have subverted elections or a government which is not completely legit for maximum 4 years. What we are talking about is that the decisions that are taken under a campaign and just under the campaign and under the after the election are very bad, and they are going to be killing people. I'm going to start with closing opposition before to be to the main clash of this debate. They say two main things. First main thing is that the accountability is very important, and right now we have lack of accountability, and the other only way of doing real accountability is through the elections. I have several rebuttals for this. First rebuttal is that this is completely untrue. We have a lot of resources in order to make accountability for them. First of all, the parliament, second of the Supreme Court, and it's no excuse that they are under a state of alarm, because under a state of alarm, you know, in most countries in the world has to be approved by, you know who, the parliament. The president has not the power unless in a couple of presidential countries in order to approve the state of alarm. Therefore, they have to go to the parliament every 2 or 3 weeks in order to pass the state of alarm. Therefore, I think that this line that you are not going to hold accountable. Second thing, I don't see why accountability is the most important thing in the short term. Is they are doing good things. The most important thing is if they are doing good or bad things. If they are doing very good things and they have no accountability, this is not very important. And why? Well, because I am lacking accountability for what? How much? 1 year, 6 months? That's not important. Accountability is not a major impact in this debate by itself. It's only how it impacts the decision-making process, which they put very little analysis on that. And finally, and this is a subsidiary rebuttal, if they are right and the government is so powerful in that moment and they are like taking very bad decision and controlling the whole country, I think that this is the worst moment to take the decision, the election, right? Because they can like subvert the elections, especially in countries which are not especially democratic, like prohibiting some press and some publicity for the other parties under the excuse that they are under a state of alarm. So if they are right and there are so much power at the moment, which they don't have in that moment, therefore I think this is the worst moment in order to have an election, because they are going to manipulate it much easier. Secondly, on closing government, I think here we're starting with the most important class of the debate. They say, hey, they are going to vote against you if you don't take if you take a populist decision, because they are going to be looking at the health crisis, and that's the most important thing in the campaign. I have 5 rebuttals here. First of all, we already say, and no of the mechanisms of the Antonio was even try to rebuttal, that they are lying actively with the data. Therefore, you are not going to have noticed that more kills are doing. And after 6 months that press put it down, it's not so easy in a couple of weeks or 1 month that the campaign lasts. Secondly, the short-term consequences of this decision are not seen. You're not dying of coronavirus in 2 weeks. You take the decision, people goes out, people get contagious, and after 2 months they die. After that, the government has already put the election 2 months ago. You cannot see in the short term this decision. Thirdly, you can stop testing and with that you also have a very good claim to the electorate. And fourthly, we think that the economy is also very important for them, and especially for rich people who have power to mobilize the population, because they are not exposed to the virus, because they work at their home and they don't care if the electorate goes to the factory, if the workers go to the factory and put their heads in danger. Finally, they are going to say, and this is very important, they have to say that things are doing well. Nobody's voting a government which say we are doing very bad, people is dying, we are in a horrible crisis. therefore they have huge incentive in order to lie to you, in order to say that things are doing well, and therefore it's going to be created a false narrative that we are doing better, that we don't have to stay at home, that we can reactivate the economy, and so on and so on. Now, going into the opening and the main clash of this debate, why we think that democracy does not get subverted, or that this is a wash. We think that, A, as I said before, there is a lot of power of the government in order to manipulate these elections, in order using the fear, saying that here we are solving the problem. If you now vote another political party, there is going to be a change. The committee which is studying this problem is working very well right now. As I say to you, things are getting better. Don't vote for another one, therefore they can subvert the democracy. I think that this is also a claim for our side. Secondly, they have this overwhelming power that I say. And thirdly, and with this I go to the class about contagious, they have the possibility of taking very bad decisions. We think that this bad decision making is, as Antonio told you, impacting in the health, but it's also a democratic claim because they are not taking decision based on the best interest of the population, but rather in themselves. Now, what did Antonio told you, and it's key for this debate about the decision making? They told you, and it is massively unresponsive, that before the elections, you are going to have to take very bad decisions. You are going to have to lie to the people. You are going to have to open factories. You are going to have to let people go party, because if not, is that things are not going well. You have to picture a whole narrative of the country going well in order to the people say, okay, let's vote the government. And this is killing hundreds of people. And secondly, part that they say, after the election, there is going to be an instability process. Meanwhile, they take the government. It's going to be alliances. It's going to be time in order that they take new decisions. It's going to be difficult to subvert previous decisions, because you cannot say one day after the election, all the issues that we say before has to be cancelled. Therefore, many people is going to die because of that. Regardless to this, 0 for closing opposition. Now, a point from OO.
Look, we don't value accountability because some people might be competent, but because only the constant norm of constant accountability can remove a bad government. Incentives of a bad government to lie are...
I think I answered this in my last point. My last point is why we prefer saving lives of people over democracy. First point is that I think that I massively diminish the case of democracy, because it's also harm on the other side of the house, because the government takes bad decisions, because the government also can do things in order to subvert democracy. But second and third point, first of all, we think that the damage that it causes to the living of the people, it's forever, it's not temporary, while the damage that they claim in the entire opposition side is with the worst case scenario for one period. One election, okay, is subverted, okay, there is no accountability, okay, they last for another 4 years. After those 4 years, the damage is over in most society. In your case, your damage is forever, you are killing people. And second point of our party here, also the strength of the damage is greater in our side of the house. In the worst case scenario of in their place, you have a government which is not legit, controlled by the Supreme Court and the Parliament, and which is taking maybe decisions that you don't like as much as you should. In our side, people is dying. If they accept, as they are assumingly accepting, that we are saving hundreds of lives, we think that democracy is not so important in the short term, and we're very happy to stand in the comparative that the healthcare is the most important thing in the short term. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that speech, and I now invite the opposition whip to conclude this debate as a whole.
Three, two, one, start. 3 questions in my speech. First of all, how do you solve the crisis in the best way possible? Secondly, where do we get better representation? Lastly, why is the crisis the most important thing in this debate? First of all, let's talk about the crisis, because closing government really want to clash with this. And we give you a whole point about why you don't have accountability when we talk about court system, when we talk about parliament, emergency law, public pressure that exists to suppress a lot of stuff. Note also, you have a lot of really tough decisions that you actually need to make. This means that a lot of times the governments just aren't accountable and don't know what the right decision is. This means that they need to listen to outside criticism. What do closing government have to say about this? They tell us, well, you know, a lot of times the parliament is the one that decides the laws. First of all, note that this is really partial answers to all of the stuff that we actually said, but more of a note, in times of crisis, especially, but not only, parliament is controlled by the ones that control the government. This means that once you have the lack of public pressure and stuff like that, they're much more able to push all of these laws much more harsher. This means that they are able to take away from the opposition the tools to regulate the government. This means that we are not likely to have checks and balances. How does this compare to opening opposition? Opening opposition tells us that, well, maybe sometimes you can actually change leadership and then you can get other types of policies. We explain why this is necessarily the case when people are just dissatisfied from the crisis itself and how it is dealt. And this is the larger impact here, because this just means that a lot of people are dying in the masses and the economy is tanking. Secondly, they tell us, look, the opposition can sometimes just offer ideas. We actually explain why in a lot of situations this is just going to turn into policy, because it's just beneficial for leaders once they see that a lot of people like these ideas. Note, if you don't have an active opposition in the country because it's suppressed by all this public pressure, this just means that in a lot of situations you're not going to hear these ideas in the first place. People are not going to buy into them, and this means that we get less creativity here. Moreover, even if you don't accept that we extend an opening opposition already, we just add a lot. First of all, we add why in situations where the government isn't accountable, there is no way to change policy, right? The government is likely to fixate on specific ideas, not putting masks, stuff that we see all day long when you're talking about the COVID crisis, but we actually need a change of policy. But these leaders just prefer thinking that they are the ones correct and not listen to other criticisms because they believe that this is good with their voters. Moreover, we offer a comparative. We actually offer why people are going to change the opinions of the policymakers and the government, specifically because the public listens to public healthcare crisis and scientists in a lot of these situations. And this means that they're now going to take upon themselves a lot of new ideas and shove them into the political system. The more you have more elections, the more you're more likely to listen to the people and what they actually want. Closing government tell us, well, you know, in really extreme situations, you can just prevent the elections by by the mechanisms that we give. This is just false. Why? Because preventing the elections without this law is something which is A, structured inside the constitution. B, court system can actually say something regarding it without adding this law. Once we add this law, they actually can't say anything about it because the government controls all the definitions of what is a crisis and what not. Let's compare this to populism. First of all, note that populism under a government side just becomes worse and worse because you don't have accountability. And politicians just look for a way to justify themselves as long as they are in a crisis, because note, each and every time they have elections coming up in the next 6 months, right? Because the moment the crisis ends, there are going to be elections. So this means that in each and every step, they have this incentive to do all the stuff that closing government talk about. If we're actually able to replace them, this just means that under our side, we get this populism for a shorter period of time. But moreover, the only response that we get from them is, you know, they're going to lie up to the public and we're not going to have information. Note that they don't analyze this. A few responses to that. Journalism, health systems, publishing statistics, NGOs, public websites, dead body count, right? You know people dying from the crisis. I honestly think that you can't hide all of this. When closing government doesn't analyze this in any way, this is just enough to take down the closing government extension by its whole. But moreover, once you have politicians from the opposition, they're just more likely to present this situation and different policies that actually help in other countries, and you have all the evidence in the world to support this. Let's talk about representation, because opening government tells us people can't go out and vote because they're really afraid to get out of the house. Honestly, like vote in mail just solves all of their case and prevents people from leaving the house. Voting in capsules in a few a month or 2 months long election is enough. People coming with hazmat suits to your house to take your vote and actually transfer it on, right? There are so many solutions to this. We just believe that this isn't a problem. But we also say something which is much more. First of all, in the first place, this government isn't representative because it doesn't have accountability, because it doesn't listen to ideas, because it doesn't insert a lot of these new policies into play. This just means that it's illegitimate to begin with, and we need to have the ability to replace it if this is the case. Secondly, note, you
actually have questions of what is more important, the economy or healthcare, right? Questions that this government doesn't have a mandate to make because people didn't vote on this to begin with. This means that these are the most important questions that we have in this debate, in this period of time of governance. We just believe that this is better. Before I go on, yes, opening.
We endlessly explained that people cannot make rational and representative decisions at this time, neither about the crisis nor about other topics. Why is a new government necessarily better?
Well, you don't really explain it, right? The only explanation that's that the media is really covering this issue. We think that this is a good situation that provides people a lot of information that they can pick regarding the elections. This just means that they are able to listen to the scientists and just implement new policies. No, all of this actually proves what opening opposition set out to say, why this crisis is just more important in the next 3 years. But moreover, why is this crisis the most important thing in this debate? First of all, when we're talking about the amount of people damaged, right? The amount of people killed, healthcare, and economic crisis, these are things that exist and have a massive impact, right? This answers to the point coming from opening government when we also give the comparative of the next 3 years are just going to be so much less impactful because you don't have the crisis to deal with, because all of the decisions you make today are going to affect your country for a long period of time. But moreover, on the national level, when you look internally, when you are able to actually replace each and every state, each and every governor, each and every district, you're just going to have much better responses to this crisis. This is better in each and every level of representation. Lastly, even if in a small chance, this is a large impact, we are really proud to oppose.
Thank you all for the